Here we go.
Welcome, Ishac.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Martin. And I want to thank first all participants really for their interest and their resilience. We have launched the lab now about 2 hours ago, and it's great that you're still with us. And I want to welcome our panelists. Justin, it is 8:45 p.m. in Beijing, and you're joined there under this beautiful tree by Jiajun. And we have Shang-Jin in New York, where it's 8:45 in the morning. So good morning, good evening. And Hannah, where are you?
I'm currently in the UK, not too far away.
Okay, you're in the middle of the time zone. I'm myself in France right now. So this is indeed the session on China and Africa, central player in the development domain, and we'll focus on financial issue, and we're really building on FDL's recent push to work with you to understand the role of China in financing development better, and also how it can be improved. And this itself builds on the rising tide of very interesting research, more research interest on understanding really China and its relationship around the world. Just to get started, I need to remind our audience that starting at around the year 2000, China has emerged as a very large development financier to Africa in particular, but also to some other developing countries, together with its rise as a major trading partner in the context of its Belt and Road Initiative. And so there was provision of official development assistance, ODA, but that's a small part of the story. Banks and firms were also encouraged to do business with about 100 developing countries. And China's total financial involvement in these countries is now estimated to be close to $1 trillion. So it's a massive investor in development. And for the group of the poorest countries, the LICs, China's loan portfolio has increased over the past 20 years to be around $100 billion, which is 25% of these countries' total debt. And it's about equal to the debt owed to the World Bank. So it's a major player, including in the poorest countries. Now, there are many issues that arise, especially in this increasingly polarized world between blocs, OECD, China, BRICS. And so what happens with China on trade, on finance, on technology, on the climate, greatly affects the interest of developing countries. Now, whether the global public goods, many aspects, not just the climate, trade, but also say how to deal with the debt overhang that we've talked about in the previous session. Whether this is marked by cooperation or by competition between these two blocs is a defining issue for our time, and we'll speak about that today. So we have a wonderful panel, and let me introduce them one by one as I call on them. We'll have 2 quick rounds of Q&A and in a conversational mode, and then we'll move to Q&A with the audience. So allow me first to introduce Professor Justin Lin under the Cherry Tree. He's the Dean of the Institute of New Structural Economics and the Dean of the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development. And he's the Dean of the National School of Development, all of which are housed at Peking University. He was the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist for the World Bank when I was there, and I had really the pleasure of interacting with him a lot and receiving him also in Ghana, where I was the country director. So it's great Justin, that you're with us today. You're a very influential researcher and author. So let us perhaps help us set up the scene, which is more complex than people think. Give us a sense of China, many types of involvement with developing country. And it would be great if you could also help us connect that a little bit with China's own experience with development, how its own experience develops, colors this relation. Justin?
Very good. I first like to congratulate the launch of
FDL.
Right.
I think it's a very important initiative. And I'm also honored to participate in this panel and to share with you some of my understanding about China. And regarding your questions, China's experiences about development financing, and also how these experiences shape China's involvement with other developing countries. Well, I think any country, when they have involvement with other countries, very often they draw the lessons from their own countries or project the lessons to other countries. Certainly, China followed that. But it's very unique. We know that China has done very well in terms of economic development, because in the past 42 years, the average annual growth rate in China was 9.2%, a miracle. And also China eliminated the poverty. More than 800 million people were pulled out of poverty. In spite of, China has a financial repression. The Chinese financial system is dominated by large banks and stock markets. And also the interest rate in China are artificially replaced. So typical financial repression. And we need to know why China adopts this kind of very distorted financial system. At the same time, how come China can do so well in terms of sustaining development and elimination of poverty? The reason why China had this kind of financial depression was China adopted a dual track, gradual approach in the transition from the planning economy to a market economy. At the beginning of the transition, there were many large, capital-intensive, state-owned enterprises. And in those kind of sectors, they went against China's competitive advantages. Because China at that time was one of the poorest countries. Capital was scarce. China did not have competitive advantages in the capital-intensive industry. But Chinese government adopted a dual-track approach. On the one hand, continue to provide necessary subsidies and protection towards all the large-scale state-owned enterprises, and to maintain the stability. And stability is very important for development. But China also liberalized their entry to the labor-intensive industry, which certainly are China's competitive advantages. But within those kind of financial structure, those firms in the labor-intensive industry, in general, are smaller scales, and they did not use much capitals. But they need to have capitals. Otherwise, they cannot grow, they cannot make investment. And under this kind of situation, how come they can grow so rapidly, create so much job, and provide a dynamic growth in China? I think the reason was because first, in the labor-intensive industry, first, the larger one, China invited foreign direct investment to China. They brought in their own capital from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, from Korea. And the domestic one at the beginning, they only went into very small scale labor-intensive industry. Since they were small scale, they did not require much capital. But more importantly, those sectors are consistent with China's competitive advantage. But when we say the competitive advantages only means the effective cost of production were low, because China has abundant supply of labor force, the wage rate is very low. So the effective cost of production is very low. However, the competition in domestic market and international market is a competition of total cost. total cost has something called transaction cost. And the most important transaction cost were the cost of infrastructure, the access to market and so on, the access to power and so on. And the Chinese government also did not provide financial direct support to those kind of labor-intensive industry. But Chinese government invested aggressively in the infrastructure to reduce the transaction cost, to reduce the cost to market access, to the port and so on, and to bring down the total cost. And when the total cost is competitive, those firms are very profitable. Since they are profitable, if they want to have a technological upgrading, industrial upgrading, they use their own capital for investment. Those are the most important source of investment. So then China, had a lesson. And summarize, if a countries want to get rich, if a country want to create job, they should invest in the infrastructure. And that is how those sharing were generated. And certainly when China, after 2008, you said, started to play its role as an active participant of global development cooperation, China project that lesson to other countries. From our Chinese experiences, Chinese government under the financial repression did not provide the financial access to the firms in the labor-intensive industry at all. Today, we still discuss that today. Almost every year, I'm arguing we should remove financial repression. We should allow the local small bank to develop in order to provide financial access to those kind of small and medium-sized firms in China. But they can grow very well because of those kind of infrastructure investment. And so that's the reason why when China started to play its role as a global development participant, China put a lot of effort on the improvement of infrastructure, including the Belt and Road Initiative, including setting up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Banks. So that's how I see, China, the involvement in the global development cooperation, and the root reason why China put so much emphasis on the infrastructure, because that's experiences from our own past. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Justin. You lay down the basis beautifully. So let's move now very naturally to Hannah Ryder, an economist by formation, Kenyan diplomat. Now you're an entrepreneur of ideas. You're the founder of the Development Reimagined Institute, which is an influential now African group working in China on shaping this relationship. So, pick it up from where Justin left it. So China's been keen to push for infrastructure through ODA, through loans from public banks, through its old and new multilateral banks, even FDI. Now, from an Africa perspective, what is the performance of these loans? There are criticism of debt trap diplomacy, of corruption, but there are also evaluations that show how useful this effort has been. And perhaps more important, Hannah, in which ways could this relationship be improved so that the developmental impact of this financing improves, given the new imperative that we're talking about these days of greening finance, upgrading safeguards and the like?
Thank you, Ishac, and thank you again. Let me also add my congratulations from everyone else as well to the launch of this initiative. I was really pleased to be here, and also for Development Reimagined to be one of the partners. We're looking forward to continuing to work with you. Look, I understand, people are very focused on standards. How can the finance improve? But I really want to build on exactly what Justin was saying, and also what others were saying. What African countries really need right now is more infrastructure. Yes, better quality would be fine. And of course, we should be looking at better quality, but we need more infrastructure now. Just as an example, based on estimates by my firm, Development Reimagined, the infrastructure needs to meet the SDGs in just 4 West African countries, just 4 of them. So that's Ghana, Nigeria, and Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, every year are around, in total, $75 billion, which is equivalent to about 15% of their GDP. That's what they need to be spending on infrastructure every single year in order to meet the SDGs. So in order to see Agenda 2063, the kind of industrialization that others were talking about, that efficiency, that logistics, that's what it will take. And that is on infrastructure spending. Forget everything else. It's just infrastructure spending. So, China having been open to, lending, what we have, there's a total of, it's estimated by Size Carry, the think tank, that the China's estimated has lent over $150 billion in total over the last 20 years to African countries, fairly concessional rates. This is great, but it is also a small contribution. We need so much more. And I can't emphasize this more. We need significantly more borrowing from China, significantly more from other powerful economies, more than a worldwide initiative of 600 billion announced by the G7. We can hope that that's concessional. And again, the discussion previously just now, I think really illustrates just how important that is. But so I think that the disconnect is that while the talks of kind of standards and, and transparency and environmental, green finance and so on, I think that kind of, in a sense, presumes that lending will continue. But there's so much noise around debt, sustainability, debt crisis. And I think what's been really helpful is, again, the discussions earlier today have been really clear on what is really meant by debt sustainability and so on. But I have to say also, what others didn't say and what I've said today is that there's much more spending needed, and we have to find the space for that. Also, I think practically, if we're talking about Chinese financing, with the lack of travel to and from China, the project pipelines, the very bankable project pipelines, especially if we're talking about concessional finance, those are really suffering. So in terms of priorities, it's really about it's not really the standards, it's really about making infrastructure building actually continue. Now, the other aspect, and let me just finish here, the other aspect around standards and, environmental sustainability around, even things like labor standards and local content. These are the many things that African governments, African civil society, African publics are very concerned about. How do we make infrastructure most delivering of jobs? How do we make sure that it also integrates into the economy as much as possible? What they don't tend to take into account, and I think, again, we have to remember China's not the same kind of lender as other bilateral lenders. Chinese aid and loans, and much like some bilateral lenders like Japan, the national local law of the recipients are the real benchmark. And so, it's not the donor or the creditor that imposes the standards, it's the recipient, it's the borrower, and it's therefore the African government. So that's exactly what no strings attached means. It's up to the local government, the government to say, this is what our requirements are, this is where we publish the contracts. Those laws have to be imposed by the recipient government for those need to be in place for the Chinese. So that's why, for example, South Africa can impose on Chinese contractors its national laws on Black empowerment, right? A country like Cameroon can publish all of its contracts. The standards come from the African governments deciding. A country like Uganda can have all its contracts scrutinized before parliament, before sign off. That happens. It regularly happens. I think the problem is really that not so many African countries actually kind of work together to know that they can make these things happen. They're very used to working with donors who kind of tell them what to do. So they must actually coordinate with each other to find out what they can ask from China. And that's where I think, consultants, think tanks like FDL can play a real role. It's really not really about creditors or donors or outsiders really raising the bar. That's almost kind of an old colonial way of thinking. It really is about Africans raising the bar, demanding from the rest of the world more finance, better finance, in terms of what we really need, as long as with the big infrastructure.
Thank you, Hannah. Important points you put on the table. Let's pick up on the more, right? Clearly, we saw with the other panel, there's like a liquidity crisis, especially with the new shocks coming. And so more is needed. But at the same time, something very unexpected happened, which is this collection of shocks has led to a situation of near insolvency. There is a debt problem right now. And so let's turn to Shang-Jin in New York. Shang-Jin, you're a professor of finance and economics at Columbia University. You were the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank. You lead the NBER program on China. So you studied these macro issues. Now, the debts of LDCs have risen, and China is an important recipient of debt service. Just to recall the figures, China roughly receives $9 billion from the poorest countries in debt service, and it's about the same amount that the multilateral banks receive and the private creditor receives. So we have three major creditors. The bilaterals of the Paris Club have moved to grants, so they're not big creditors anymore. And so as this debt crisis shapes up, it's more complex than in the past, because we have three major different types of creditors. China has provided debt relief much more than other creditors in the recent years, even regularly, but often or most of the time in the form of rescheduling. Maybe this is a Chinese tradition, as opposed to debt reduction. And yet, traditional research shows that this rescheduling can be an impediment to growth when the debt overhang builds up. So I wanted to ask you, what explains the reluctance to take losses? Is it its own experience, or is it the state of its financial institutions? And perhaps a harder question is, do you think that the G20's proposal for a common framework for all the creditors to come together in a cooperative solution will work? Several countries have been now in that process, and it's not working. And are there possibly other processes that may work?
Thank you, Ishac. Would you be able to give me the right to share slides?
Sure.
If you could, that would be good. But first, let me also congratulate our host and also Daniel Martin, FDL, for the formal launch of this very important initiative. Let me maybe start by.
You can share.
Great, thank you. Let me start by. I need to find my slides.
As you look, I should have emphasized that all of you on the panel have been with us since day one, and thank you for that.
Okay. Let me say, there are three global shocks that have made the debt challenge in developing countries, in Africa included, substantially more severe now than perhaps 1 or 2 years ago. First, of course, the continuation of the COVID. Many countries have done various assistance program to households and firms that have greatly increased their fiscal indebtedness, domestic plus foreign debt. So that challenge has been made more severe for that reason. And then U.S. interest rate increase for a few times now, and has not been over yet. And we should expect to see a sequence of continued interest rate hikes in the U.S. They will greatly exacerbate the debt burden in many emerging market and developing countries as well. Daniel Cohen pointed out that the interest rate increase in the US, paradoxically, have not increased real rate very much because of very high US inflation rates. However, that the same kind of comment does not apply to developing countries that borrow in dollar terms. In dollar terms, the burden of a repayment when converting from dollar to local currency has increased. And with rising US interest rates, the cost of getting new loan to offset old loans have increased substantially. And experience from the past and research has confirmed that the following US interest rate increase, normally we tend to see a wave of debt crisis in emerging market and developing countries, a wave of a foreign currency crisis, some banking crisis, financial crisis. They don't come right away, but in the next year or two, next 12 or 24 months or 36 months, we may very well see an increase in debt problems. So this is a very severe new challenge, sort of a new change to the environment we are talking about. And the third global shock is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions imposed on Russia collectively have greatly pushed up energy prices and food prices. That suddenly push up the burden facing many developing countries, especially those that are net energy importers and net food importers. A small number of them might benefit from higher commodity prices, but many will suffer from this third shock as well. So these three shocks, I think, are important global environment in which we should understand our debt problems. For many countries, the debt problem has become a lot more challenging now than before. Now, in terms of, I'm not able to put my slide on in time with too many windows open. So let me just talk through this. To think about China's potential role as a part of a solution to developing country debt problem, maybe I'll make two type of observations. One is how one should think about the debt problem in the broad context of a country's receipt of foreign capital and what role China might be able to play in that. And the other is China as a recipient of capital flow. China is one of the largest recipients of the capital flows that Ishac mentioned as well, and potential lessons we may draw from that for African countries and other developing countries. On the first one, I think it'll be productive to think about debt problem not just as a debt problem, but think of debt as an element of a country's overall capital flow. Why that perspective is important? Because many other forms of capital flows, foreign direct investment and equity investment, have intrinsically very different risk-sharing properties than debt. That is, the FDI and debt financing and equity financing, by their very nature, when a country's fundamentals not doing as well, automatically you share less of your things with whoever, firm or government that provide the financing. So that's what I mean by better risk sharing property. So one of the challenge we are seeing in developing countries is when you talk about debt problem, is also a problem of relatively unfavorable capital inflow structure. That is, capital inflow tends to be concentrated in those form of capital inflow that does not have very good risk sharing properties. Right? So therefore, when some negative shock, either domestic negative shock or global negative shock comes in, suddenly you realize it's very hard to service those debt. In contrast, if more of your capital inflows takes the form of direct investment or equity financing, you don't need to worry as much because whoever provides the financing automatically share the same risk, the risk of less favorable productivity shock, the risk of global commodity price shock, and so on. So therefore, when we think about the debt problem, that there's a stock issue and there's a future flow issue, right? And for both, it may be productive to think about how we might optimize the structure of capital flow. So let me start with the future flow problem first. That we in terms of future flows, one of the implications is that it will be very, very helpful to think about ways that the country can transition towards greater use of FDI, equity financing. They have better risk-sharing properties, and even within that, we want to think about ways to modify the feature of a debt, so that maybe some innovative form of debt that are whose payoff, whose future burden of paying financier can be better tied to the fundamentals of the borrowing country. For example, commodity price linked debt, or GDP linked debt, or some the stability mechanisms that our first panelists from the first panel speak about, and roles of China in those, right? So I think even within a debt, a longer term debt, local currency debt would give much more favorable risk coping properties to the recipient countries than the standard short-term foreign currency debt. So let me just give one thought on potential role of China in commodity price linked debt. China is actually a very special financier in this regard. China is one of the world's, maybe the world's largest importer of commodities, which means generally China stands to gain when commodity price fall, right? So therefore, it becomes a very natural partner in a commodity-linked borrowing by African countries or other commodity-producing developing countries. In other words, you can imagine a commodity price-linked debt in which China is the counterpart. That when commodity price rises or high, of course, borrowing country will find it relatively easier to service debt. When commodity price falls, this is a time when it's relatively easy for China to provide relief because it benefits from lower commodity price. If you put two pieces together, potentially one can think about an innovative debt instrument in which both sides of the financing can find tolerable or manageable risk to make it work, right? So that's an example of a potential role of China in participating in the type of a borrowing instrument that provides much better risk sharing properties, risk management properties for African and other recipient countries. In terms of a stock problem, given that we have this stock debt, because we have to think about ways beyond the standard waiver relief we talk about, but we also want to think about ways to convert some of the debt into alternative instruments that will provide those features, debt for equity swap, which China is experiencing in its domestic context. And some of those experiences perhaps can be explored and studied and see if they could be applied to converting some of the debt instruments, China as a lender into China as a participant of those instruments. On Ishac's question about debt rescheduling versus partial forgiveness, my instinct is somewhat different from I think that what's implied in Ishac's question is, why don't they simply just offer partial forgiveness? From a finance research point of view, my instinct is from a present discounted value point of view, they are in fact equivalent. You can always do a rescheduling in such a way that it can address the debt overhang problem. So a 5-year debt becoming a 15-year payment, converted into a 15-year payment schedule, that the per year repayment can be low enough that you will remove the disincentive to invest. So the Chinese lenders, banks in particular, may very well have their institutional constraint that their own bosses, politicians, might not understand the equivalence between longer payment schedule versus outright partial debt reliefs, people who do finance understand they are equivalent. So therefore, perhaps it's not as big problem as we think. So if the Chinese lenders are more willing to consider longer payment schedule, rescheduling, rather than partial forgiveness, perhaps we can work with that. That will be my my instinct. Anyway, so this is one broad concept about how to think about the debt sustainability issues in a broader context of optimizing the structure and composition of capital inflows. My second big point is about China's own experience as potential lessons for other countries. China's experience is quite interesting. So not long ago, China itself was a very, very poor country. Fewer than 2 generations ago, China was one of the poorest low-income countries in the world. Fewer than 1 generation ago, China was a lower middle-income country. So naturally, therefore, naturally, I think that it's, when the recipient countries communicate with Chinese financiers, naturally there's relatively low barriers for both the lender and the borrower to collectively think about from a development need point of view, because you can appeal to Chinese own experience. In Chinese own experience, there are a few things that maybe especially interesting to highlight. Number one, China has a very active management strategy in the composition of the capital flows that we were talking about earlier. For example, from the very beginning of the so-called reform and opening period 4.5 decades ago, China had an explicit strategy of encouraging inward foreign investment, but extremely careful about taking on foreign currency debt. So China in attracting FDL, it's not just about lowering barrier. China offered supranational treatment to foreign firms operating in China. By supranational treatment, meaning it treats foreign firms better than its own domestic firms operating in China. This is codified in Chinese corporate income tax law, right? So there's an explicit strategy to attract a particular type of capital flows. At the same time, China maintained very strict capital controls on its firms and households' ability to incur foreign currency debt. And of course, Chinese government itself did not and still does not borrow very much in foreign currency debt. So there's very active management of composition of capital inflows. Even on the financial equity inflow side, by now China has been sufficiently open, but this is a very gradual, sequenced way. There's a sequenced, controlled way of gradually opening up a foreign equity investment through first what was called the QFII, Qualified Foreign Institutional Investors Scheme, welcoming a subset of well-regarded international institutional investors to do equity investment, and gradually to so-called RQFII, and now Stock Connect and so on, recognizing that not all foreign capitals are equal in terms of the ability to help the countries, in terms of the potential risk they entail to the country, recognizing there are market failures both at home and in the international capital market. So the policies have to be calibrated to address these potential market failures. These are potential useful lessons for other developing country recipient of capital flows, and that these are concrete things that have been tried and experimented and proven in managing flows of capital. I think these hold very useful lessons for developing countries. So let me conclude here.
Thanks, Shang-Jin. You put a lot on the table. A new instrument that speaks a lot to the previous session, commodity-based bonds, in particular by China that imports those bonds. I think this is very valuable. FDI, perhaps in manufacturing, that gets pushed out of China. This talks to what Ngozi and Esther were telling us about, debt equity swaps, perhaps as a way to deal with the debt crisis. And your last point on the seniority structure. Also, I mean, the point about China restructuring all the time, that commitment to restructure may not lead to, as you say, that overhang type of incentive. I was asking if there is research on that front. I think we may want to pursue that. And then, your issue about the seniority structure is starting to get into newer, I would say, more controversial issues, but that's exactly the kind of issues I want to pursue with Jiajun, if she can hear us, because I can't see her. Jiajun, can you hear us? We cannot hear you though. Ooh, that's too bad. You're probably not very far from where Justin is. No, we cannot hear you. That's too, wonderful. Can you speak? See if we can hear you. No, we can see you, but we cannot hear you. I'm very sorry for that. Maybe in a few minutes we'll ask our technical team to try to fix that. In the meanwhile, let me follow up perhaps with few more kind of current issues. Perhaps I go back to Hannah. You know, to continue a little bit on this issue of liquidity crisis. You know, earlier Vera talked about the SDR scandal. You know, billions of dollars, hundreds of billions on the table that cannot be used at a time where developing countries have a very bad liquidity squeeze. Now, you know, China has committed recently to use its own SDR allocation to commit it to development. Are there any ideas on the table already about how this will happen and what it would be pledged to?
Yes, and I think Jiajun might be back, so I'm going to try and keep my response brief.
Well, let's tell Jiajun that whenever she's back, let her speak so that we know she's back.
Perfect, sounds good.
Very good. Good. But you go ahead and she'll come in whenever she can. Jiajun, can you speak now? Still not working. I'll ask our technical team to try harder with you. Hannah, please go on.
Sure, I'm hoping she'll come back.
Yeah, me too.
Look, there's as you mentioned, African countries through the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation mechanism proposed that China should allocate some of the SDRs that it got from the most recent allocation to African countries, and that was agreed in November 2021, and it's a total sum of $10 billion US. So it's a great starting point, and I think it also illustrates the fact that with, you know, we always say to our African stakeholders that, you know, with Chinese stakeholders, we don't ask, you don't get. So you really need to form ideas of what you would like, you know, and that is something that did happen. But as you say, the big question is, you know, why? What next? What institutions? And again, you know, our view has been very much that African institutions that, you know the continent, that understand the kind of needs and ambitions towards Agenda 2063, rather than other national interests, could really be the ideal repository for the SDRs from China and of course from others. So what we do know so far is that China has said that some of the SDRs will go to the IMF's new instruments, which is not African, but hopefully they can help to lead to some modifications in the IMF's ways of working, which would be in the African interest. But for the others, they could, for instance, be channeled to the African Development Bank. There are a number of options there, even within the African Development Bank. There's, you know, the new instruments that we were talking about in the previous session. Also, Vera Songwei and others have been working, including with the Africa Exim Bank, new ideas, the Liquidity Sustainability Facility, our own Development Reimagined Borrowers Club, or other institutions which are not yet prescribed institutions to the IMF, but nevertheless there are ways. You know, where there's a will, there's a way, and it really is China's decision as well. AIB, for instance, the New Development Bank, can even obviously go through bilateral transfers or China's own Exim Bank, for instance. So what really needs to be done is a kind of appraisal of these options from an African perspective, and then that kind of shared with Chinese organizations, you know, so that they can respond, think about these options. And of course, that's also relevant to other partners like France or and others. And so again, that's also where FDL, I think, can really play a role.
And I understand that you and your group will be working exactly on those things with support from FDL in the next weeks, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Looking forward to that.
Jiajun, are you back? Let me put another question on the table, see maybe Justin or Shang-Jin can take it. I mean, in the recent years, in the past couple of years, actually, the disbursement from various actors in China to Africa and to the developing countries has started to fall quite sharply compared to the past decade. Now, why is that? And is this likely to continue? Or to put it differently, is there a possibility for the Chinese disbursements to rise now that there is such a bad liquidity squeeze to offset that? And can China play the role of locomotive on the financial side this time that is required at this stage? Who wants to take that? Justin, do you want to try?
Yeah, well, let me offer my answer to that. Certainly my answer may be just part of it. Because in the past, as you mentioned, China has been quite aggressive and generous in supporting the investment in Africa and other, countries. But recently, you are right. There's some decline. And the main reason is because Chinese government formed. The project in many countries were a result of collusion between the Chinese civil engineers firms and the recipient governments. And because for the civil engineers firm, China certainly is very competitive. They can do almost everything. And they often collude with local governments and to lobby for those kind of infrastructure investment. And then the civil engineer firm will be the contractors for those kind of projects. And once those kind of projects were financed by the Chinese government and they complete the civil engineer part, those firms already earned the profits and they did not care about the repayment. And under the kind of situation, many projects were not so bankable, or at least they did not very carefully, think about how to make the project generate sufficient revenue to pay back the loans. And so the Chinese government changed one policy, changed a very important policy. For the civil engineer firms, certainly, they will continue to work with local government to propose the projects. But the civil engineer firm need to be involved in the operation and repayment of those projects. They should be an investors, partial financial investors for those kind of projects. Responsible, and so that caused the civil engineer firms now they have to consider the repayment issue because they will have to be the operators. They will be, have to have the responsibility for the repayment. I think that is a very important policy changes from the Chinese government, and I think that should be considered as a good changes, because with that, those kind of project design will be much more careful in making the project, will generate sufficient return, and also the civil engineer firm will be involved in how to promote the export, how to attract the Chinese manufacturing in a firm to invest, to utilize those kind of projects. So that's my understanding about the change.
That's very interesting. So
can I complement Justin's point with two other possible factors?
Exactly,
Ishac?
I was exactly going to ask you to do that and use the last minute.
So the smaller
Sorry, Shang-Jin, we'll try to get Jiajun on. Can you speak? I think she might be connected. We'll try that.
Okay. You want to go to Jiajun? Yeah, Jiajun, go ahead, please. Is that right, Martin?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Jiajun, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm sorry for the connection problem. Yes, I can hear you very clearly.
Okay,
ahead,
this is a miracle of technology, a double connection. So Jiajun, let me use the last couple of minutes to ask you the most difficult question, but really it's an area you've been thinking about. There seem to be two narratives. One, where China plays by the international rules and there is cooperation, coordination, including on debt and on other things, on multilateralism. And there is another rising narrative where there are two competing blocs, basically, China and the rest. And that would apply to, competition is bad in some areas, but maybe beneficial to developing countries in other areas. And we could imagine a totally different kind of evolution of the debt issues in the two scenarios. Can you tell us where you see the world going?
Well, first of all, let me first add my congratulations on the launch of the Finance for Your Club. And coming to a question about how we evaluate the mainstream perspective and whether China should comply with existing rules of official finance, I think we need to uncover the underlying assumption behind this mainstream perspective. And the underlying assumption is that the existing rules are the best. And this appears to be plausible because the rationale for establishing the multilateral debt surveillance, debt sustainability surveillance framework is trying to deter the imprudent lending and borrowing, which has led to debt crisis in the past. But if we have a closer look at the debt surveillance framework that has been implemented by the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, we will find that the existing rules are not free from flaws. Because if we look at the non-concessional borrowing policy, which was introduced by the World Bank in 2006, it was essentially a top-down uniform ceiling for external borrowing. So the borrowers of the World Bank International Finance Association are not allowed to borrow so-called non-concessional finance. That is, loans with higher interest rates, for instance. The purpose of this rule is try to deter imprudent lending and borrowing. But this rule has been very stringent, and it comes at the expense of unduly constraining borrowers from obtaining much needed long-term investment with transformative potential. And in order to address this undue rigidity of the existing rules, the African leaders and China and other emerging economies have come together and tried to call for more flexibility in the debt sustainability surveillance framework by the Bretton Woods institutions. And their efforts have borne fruit. And in 2010, the World Bank and the IMF have introduced more flexibility and come up with more tailored approach. But the existing rules has not gone far enough. They try to systematically take into account the usage of debt. If the debt today can have to promote the structural change in the economy to increase the debt surveillance capacity in the future, and then the debt is sustainable in the long run. So coming back to the main question that you posed earlier, what is the role of China in shaping international rules of resource finance? I think I can use one word to end my intervention. That is destructive, creative destruction. So on the one hand, it could be destructive because we see that lack of coordination among all players, advanced economies in the past led to that crisis in the 1970s and in the 1980s. And so there's good reason to believe that lack of coordination between advanced economy and emerging economy today may lead to another round of financial arms race that may lead to the debt crisis. So we need coordination. We need to make sure that we have safeguards in place that can have the deter imprudent lending and borrowing. However, on the other hand, the influence China is also created because the competitive pressure posed by China upon the existing players have to address the undue rigidity of the existing rules and to allow the rules for transformative change in the borrowing countries, such as in Asian countries. So in that sense, I hope that China can be a reform-minded stakeholder in this international finance architecture to have to, on the one hand, so to do two things. One is to control on the existing rules to make sure that its external debt is sustainable. And so the second point is that they also can have to be creative and constructive in reforming the existing rules,
Right.
and to make the rules to ensure that the transformative change is feasible. Yeah, that's my intervention for now.
Thank you, Jiajun. I'm very happy that we managed to connect. Jiajun is the executive dean of the Institute of New Structural Economics at Peking University. I think this was a very fitting last word, Jiajun. We're running out of time, but you probably summarized in a few words what the FDL should really be about. Right? Creative destruction to get rid of the old that doesn't work well, in order to create win-win situations for all, of new rules that work better for all. So thank you for that. Let me thank the whole panel. This was fascinating. There are lots of research issues that we'll be working on that have emerged during this discussion. We're running a little bit late and we have to move quickly to the next one. So good night and good day in New York. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.